Marietta, Georgia, January 13, 1972. A 9-year-old girl laced up her brand new lavender shoes, the ones she got for Christmas just 2 weeks before, and walked out the front door. Nobody knew it then, but those shoes would become the most haunting detail of a 51-year mystery. Because when her body was finally found 16 days later, the shoes were gone. Someone had taken them. Her name was Debbie Lynn Randall, Debbie to everyone who loved her, third grader at Pine Forest Elementary, freckle-faced, full of energy. The kind of kid who didn't just enter a room, she lit it up. When family friends came to visit, they brought dolls for her, not because anyone told them to, just because they knew it would make Debbie smile. But there was another side to Debbie that people don't always mention. She was the queen of the neighborhood baseball team, tough, competitive, fast, and her favorite person to play against was her older brother, Melvin, 10 years old, just 1 year ahead of her and her closest friend in the world. That Thursday evening, Melvin was sick in bed. He had a fever. TV show was on, and when the family's laundry needed to go to the Duds and Suds laundromat barely half a block from their apartment, Melvin stayed behind. He would spend the next 50 years wishing he hadn't. 1972 Marietta was a different world. Neighbors knew each other's names. Kids walked to the corner store alone. Nobody locked their doors before dark. It was the kind of town where a parent could send a child half a block away and feel completely fine about it. That's important to understand, because what Frank did next wasn't careless. It was normal. Debbie's stepfather walked with her to the laundromat. He loaded the family's clothes into 2 machines, got them running, handed Debbie the coins she'd need to switch the loads when the first cycle finished, and walked home. Half a block, a child who knew the neighborhood. Machines that needed another 40 minutes. There was no reason to worry, except somewhere out there that evening, a man in a dark pickup truck was already watching. Inside the laundromat, Debbie did what Debbie always did. She played. She stacked empty detergent boxes. She talked with the other girls who were folding clothes nearby. Time moved the way it does when you're 9 and the world still feels safe. Then, at 7:15 p.m., Debbie stood up. She looked at the girls inside, said goodbye, and pushed open the door. That was the last moment. The last ordinary, unremarkable moment before everything changed. A 12-year-old girl was standing outside near the building. She saw a man grab Debbie. She watched it happen, but she didn't scream. She didn't run for help. Because her brain made the assumption most people would make. She thought it was a father grabbing his misbehaving daughter, so she stayed quiet. But then the man's truck started moving, fast, reckless, tearing away from the curb, and the 12-year-old had to jump back to avoid being hit. As the truck accelerated, she caught one final glimpse of the driver in the rearview mirror. He was looking directly at her, not panicked, not hurried, just watching, measuring, deciding she wasn't a problem. Then he was gone. By 7:30 p.m., Debbie had not come home. By 8:30, her mother Juanita couldn't wait anymore. She walked to the laundromat, and an employee told her the little girl had left over an hour ago. Juanita moved fast after that, and in a parking lot across the street from their own apartment, she stopped walking. On the ground, a spilled box of laundry detergent, and on the side of a Volkswagen Beetle parked nearby, small handprints, child-sized, smudged downward as if small hands had been pressing against the car while being dragged away from it. A second witness later confirmed they had seen a dark 1950s pickup truck backed up to that exact spot around 7 p.m. and watched it tear away at speed. The truck was already long gone, and somewhere inside it was a 9-year-old girl in brand new lavender shoes who had just waved goodbye to a room full of strangers, thinking she was simply going home. Melvin lay in his bed that night, sick and unaware. He didn't know that the last time he heard his sister's voice was the last time he would ever hear it. He wouldn't find out who took her for 51 years. But here is what makes this case different from so many others. The people who worked it never stopped. Not in 10 years, not in 30. Not even when the trail went completely cold, because they had something. 2 small pieces of evidence, carefully preserved, waiting for a world that didn't yet have the technology to understand them. What those 2 pieces eventually revealed, and who they pointed to, is a story that will leave you questioning everything you think you know about how long the truth can hide. John Randall got the call at the Ford Motor Plant and left without hesitation. Within the hour, the family was moving through the neighborhood in every direction, knocking on doors, calling her name, retracing every step Debbie might have taken. And Melvin got out of bed. Fever or no fever, his little sister was missing. He pulled on his shoes and went outside. A 10-year-old boy, still sick, going door to door through the dark, asking every neighbor the same questions. Have you seen Debbie? Do you know where she is? Every single person said no. But what they also said, every one of them, was that they couldn't believe it. Not Debbie, not here, not on this street. The Marietta police came quickly. Officers documented the fingerprints on the car, noted the spilled detergent, and took statements from both witnesses. The 12-year-old's account and a second adult witness together helped build a composite sketch of the driver. But a sketch is just lines on paper, and the truck was already gone. What happened next is something this city has never fully been given credit for. They called it Operation Debbie. More than 4,000 volunteers mobilized. 4,000 people who had never met the Randall family, who simply could not sit at home knowing a child was out there somewhere. The Concerned Citizens Committee organized search grids. Ham radio operators set up communication networks across the county. Cobb and Marietta civil defense workers coordinated teams through the surrounding neighborhoods and wooded areas. And moving through all of it, still pushing, was Melvin Randall, 10 years old, going door to door with a stack of flyers that had his sister's face on them, talking to strangers, walking streets he had already walked. At home, Debbie's baseball bat leaned against the wall where she had left it. Nobody moved it. 5 days passed, then 10, then 2 full weeks. Silence. No credible sightings, no confirmed leads, nothing that brought investigators any closer to the man in that pickup truck. And this is the part that deserves more than a sentence, because the days that followed Debbie's disappearance were not just a gap on a timeline. They were 16 days of a family suspended between hope and the thing they were most afraid of. Juanita woke up every morning not knowing if her daughter was alive or dead. John went through the motions of existing while a piece of him was missing. And Melvin carried the specific, crushing guilt of the person who was supposed to be there and wasn't. January 29, 1972. Cold, gray, raining steadily, the kind of rain that soaks through everything and makes the world feel heavier than it already is. A group of Southern Tech students were still out searching. One of those students was a young man named Mike Mahan, a Vietnam veteran who had come home from the war and enrolled in school trying to build something normal. He had seen things in Vietnam that most people never have to see. He was still not prepared for what he found. After several hours in the rain, moving through heavy trees near the Fox Hill subdivision on Powers Ferry Road, Mike Mahan stopped walking. There were drag marks in the dirt ahead of him, long, deliberate lines cut into the wet ground, heading deeper into the trees. He followed them. About 1,000 feet south of Windy Hill and Powers Ferry Road, in the mud and the rain and the silence, he found Debbie Lynn Randall. She was fully clothed. Only her socks remained on her feet. The lavender shoes were gone. Someone had removed them and kept them, a detail that tells you something dark and deliberate about the person who did this. Dr. Larry Howard of the Georgia State Crime Lab confirmed that Debbie had been assaulted and that her cause of death was strangulation. Investigators believed her killer had used her own coat to silence her during the attack. Then a geologist analyzed the dirt found on Debbie's clothing and made a finding that shifted the entire investigation. The soil came from 2 different locations. One matched the dump site. The other matched a specific clay composition from the Dixie Cast and Stone Company on Powers Ferry Road, roughly 3 miles away. Debbie was not killed where she was found. She was killed somewhere else, then moved. Her killer had time. He had a plan. He knew the area well enough to choose 2 separate locations. 2 pieces of evidence were recovered near the body. A strand of brown hair. Lab analysis determined it came from a white male, likely between 18 and 30 years old, and a small circular piece of cloth with a flowery design. Both were logged. Both were carefully preserved, and with 1972 technology, both were useless. Thousands packed into Roswell Street Baptist Church for Debbie's funeral. Church overflowed into the street. A city that had spent 16 days searching now gathered in a silence so heavy it pressed against the walls. Debbie was buried at Kenstone Memorial Park. Her killer went home, closed his door, went on with his life. Certain the case was going cold, certain the trail had died with Debbie in those woods. He was almost right, but he made one mistake. He left something behind, and it was waiting for him. Every episode represents 15 days of deep research and long nights spent chasing the truth for those who deserve to be remembered. If you value these stories, please like, subscribe, and check the description for more solved cold cases. Now, let's get back to the case. The 4 detectives who worked this case in 1972, Lieutenant Bill Hudson, Major Tim Buckley, Captain Bill Elliott, and Lieutenant Ray Owens, were not careless men. They followed every lead. Hundreds of tips came in from across Marietta and Cobb County. Each one was tracked down. Each one was checked. Each one went nowhere. The composite sketch led to no identification. The dark pickup truck was never traced. The witnesses gave everything memory could hold, and it wasn't enough. But before those detectives moved on, they did something quiet. Something that would matter more than anything else they could have done. In 1972, with no database to check and no technology to analyze what they had found, they preserved everything anyway. The strand of brown hair, the small circular cloth, every piece of physical evidence from the scene. Logged carefully, stored properly, sealed inside a box addressed, without knowing it, to the future. They couldn't have imagined, when they sealed that box, that what was inside would one day speak louder than any witness ever could. Years passed, then decades. The Randall family lived with the silence. Juanita kept every newspaper article ever printed about Debbie's case. John carried something heavy behind his eyes that never fully left. Melvin grew up, built a life, watched his own hair go gray, and still woke up some mornings with the same question pressing against the inside of his chest. Who took her? In 2001, a detective named Morris Nix went looking through old cold case files. Nix was not approaching this case from a distance. He was a lifelong Marietta resident. He had been young when Debbie disappeared, old enough to remember exactly what those 16 days did to this community, old enough to remember his mother telling him to stay inside, old enough to remember adults speaking in lowered voices, the way the neighborhood felt different after, like something had been taken from the air itself. When Nix opened that evidence box, what he felt wasn't professional curiosity, it was something older than that, something personal. He sent the preserved hair to the FBI for testing. Results came back with a partial DNA profile, white male, consistent with the 1972 lab findings. Investigators ran it against every available database. Nothing. The man who killed Debbie had no DNA on record anywhere. The profile existed, but it pointed at a ghost, a biological description with no name attached. The technology simply wasn't ready. Nix put the evidence back, closed the box, and waited for the world to catch up. In March 2015, Cobb County built something new, a cold case unit dedicated to revisiting unsolved cases with fresh eyes and updated science. In its first 2 years, the unit solved 9 cases, 8 arrests, 6 criminal prosecutions. Morris Nix came back. He brought Debbie's file with him. This time, attention shifted to the circular cloth. It had spent over 40 years in that evidence box, holding on to something it hadn't yet been asked to give. The cloth was sent to a forensic lab for updated DNA analysis. A partial male profile came back. Investigators ran it through CODIS, the National Combined DNA Index System containing profiles from convicted offenders across the entire country. If this man had ever been arrested and processed anywhere in America, the system would find him. The search came back empty. After 43 years of waiting, after preserved evidence and FBI testing and a brand new cold case unit, the killer had still never put himself in the system. He had lived his entire life without leaving a record serious enough to flag him. Another dead end. The cloth went back into storage. In October 2021, the DA's office received new federal funding, a Bureau of Justice grant allocated specifically for cold case work. And that money unlocked something that hadn't existed as a viable investigative tool even 5 years earlier: genetic genealogy. The idea is this: you are no longer searching for the killer himself. You are searching for his blood. Somewhere out there, a relative of the man who killed Debbie Lynn Randall had voluntarily uploaded their own DNA to a public ancestry website. They did it to find cousins, to trace family history. They had no idea that a piece of cloth from a 1972 crime scene in Marietta, Georgia was about to find them. In 2022, the cloth was sent to DNA Labs International, a Florida-based forensic laboratory. Their task was to build a SNP profile detailed enough to cast a net across millions of publicly available genetic records and pull out any thread, however distant, that connected back to the DNA on that cloth. Somewhere in a database full of ordinary people tracing their family trees, there was a genetic breadcrumb that led back to a murderer, and investigators were now going to follow it, one relative at a time, building a family tree branch by branch until they arrived at a name. The cloth had waited 50 years in the dark. It already knew who put it there. In 2023, it finally told someone. What followed was painstaking work. Investigators didn't get a name immediately. Genetic genealogy doesn't work that way. What they got first was a familial connection, a partial genetic overlap suggesting that someone in the database was related to the DNA contributor on that cloth, not the killer himself. A relative, possibly a distant one who had never heard of Debbie Lynn Randall. From that single connection, investigators began constructing a family tree by hand, branch by branch, generation by generation, cross-referencing public records, census data, and death certificates to map out who was related to whom and how far back those relationships went. The goal was to work inward, start with the relative who had uploaded their DNA, trace the family lines backward and sideways, and narrow down to a specific individual matching the profile established by original forensic evidence. White male, likely between 18 and 30 years old in 1972. Connected in some way to the Marietta apartment complex where Debbie Randall lived. The tree kept growing, the circle kept narrowing, and then a name emerged: William B. Rose, Mableton, Georgia, 24 years old on January 13, 1972. Investigators ran his name through every available record. And here is the first thing that stopped them cold. William B. Rose had never been a suspect in this case, not in 1972. Not in 2001 when the FBI tested the hair, not in 2015 when the cold case unit reopened the file. Not once in 51 years had his name appeared anywhere in the investigation. He had been completely invisible. His criminal record offered almost nothing: a handful of alcohol-related arrests, no violence on record, no history that would have raised a flag. To anyone who knew him, William Rose was just a young man from Mableton with a drinking problem and a circle of people who saw nothing in him that looked like what he actually was. But here is the connection that explained everything and nothing at the same time. Rose had family members who lived in the same apartment complex as the Randall family. He had been there before, possibly many times. Investigator Ron Alter later noted that children in that complex frequently played outside. Rose had likely seen Debbie before, probably more than once. He knew the area. He knew the rhythms of the place. And on the evening of January 13, 1972, when a 9-year-old girl in lavender shoes walked out of a laundromat alone, he saw an opportunity, not a plan, not a premeditated target, an opportunity. That is what makes this case so deeply unsettling. Debbie was not chosen because of who she was. She was chosen because of when she was there. A matter of minutes, a matter of being in the wrong place at the exact moment. A dangerous man happened to be watching. There was one problem with making the case official. William B. Rose was dead. He had taken his own life in 1974, just 2 years after Debbie's murder. He was 26 years old. And according to conversations that investigator Ron Alter had with Rose's surviving family members, Rose had been visibly afraid in the time leading up to his death. Afraid of going to jail. Anxious in a way his family couldn't fully explain, because they assumed his fear was connected to his minor alcohol incidents. They had no idea what he was actually carrying. Alter's assessment was direct. Rose likely believed investigators were closing in on him. Whether that was true or simply a paranoia born from guilt, nobody can say for certain. What is certain is that he chose to end his life before he could be made to answer for what he had done. He almost took the truth with him. Almost. Before any announcement could be made, investigators needed absolute confirmation. The familial DNA match was strong. The circumstantial connections were compelling. But strong and compelling are not the same as confirmed. And in a case this old, with a family that had waited this long, confirmed was the only acceptable standard. With the full cooperation and blessing of Rose's surviving family, who had no prior knowledge of his involvement and were devastated by what they were learning, his body was exhumed. Direct DNA samples were taken and compared against the profile from the cloth. The match was exact. William B. Rose was Debbie Lynn Randall's killer. Not probably, not likely, confirmed. September 18, 2023, Cobb County, Georgia. District Attorney Flynn D. Brody Jr. stood at the podium. The loss of a loved one, especially one of such a tender age, is difficult to comprehend. This family has waited for decades for an answer. This information will not replace the pain of losing Debbie Lynn. Then, Morris Nix, the lifelong Marietta resident who had carried this case in his chest since childhood, who had reopened it in 2001. who had never let it go, stepped forward and said the line that will stay with everyone who heard it. Technology does not get old, it doesn't retire, it doesn't get sick, and it doesn't quit. Technology was seeking William Rose, and it found him in the grave, 51 years. One piece of cloth. One man who thought he had escaped. He hadn't. But the hardest part of this story isn't the science, it isn't the investigation, it isn't even the killer. The hardest part is who was not in that room on September 18th, 2023 to hear the answer finally spoken out loud. There was one person in that room who had been waiting for this moment for 51 years. Not a detective, not a prosecutor, not a forensic scientist, a grandfather. Melvin Randall stood at that press conference with gray in his hair and a lifetime behind his eyes. He was 10 years old when his sister disappeared. He was sick in bed that evening. He stayed home. And for decades after, through his teenage years, through raising his own children, through becoming a grandfather of 2, that one fact never stopped finding him. He was supposed to be there. He wasn't, and she was gone. When Melvin spoke, he didn't speak like a man consumed by grief. He spoke like a man who had done the hard, invisible work of making peace with something that never fully deserved peace. After a while, I blamed myself, he said. I was her big brother. I battled with it for a long time, but then I realized there was nothing I could have done. It just happened, and it wasn't my fault. Those words didn't come free. You don't arrive at that kind of clarity without passing through years of darkness first. But what Melvin said next is the part that stops you completely. He forgave William B. Rose, not because what Rose did was forgivable, not because 51 years erased the weight of it, but because Melvin Randall had learned the hard way over a long time that carrying hatred only keeps hurting you. I learned over the years, hate don't do you no good. Holding grudges don't do you no good. And then he turned his attention to Rose's family, people who had cooperated fully with investigators, who had given their DNA, who had agreed to an exhumation, and who had spent their entire lives not knowing what the man they loved had done. I want them to know I have no animosity toward them, no hatred. I wish them all the best. We'll be praying for them too. A man who lost his sister at age 10, praying for the family of the man who took her. There is no script for that kind of grace, but grace cannot change what was lost. Juanita Randall spent the last years of her life battling leukemia. In July 2018, even while sick, she gave an interview. She talked about Debbie, about the pain that never left, about the hope she still carried. I would at least like to know who done it before I pass away, she said. I didn't get that. Juanita died on September 17, 2018. In accordance with her wishes, her ashes were buried alongside Debbie's body at Kenstone Memorial Park because even in death, she did not want to be apart from her daughter. The answer came 5 years too late for her. John Randall held on longer. He kept every newspaper clipping. He gave interviews. He kept talking because he kept hoping that someone would see it, that someone would come forward, that justice would arrive while he was still alive to see it. John Randall died in January 2022, 3 days before the 50th anniversary of Debbie's murder. He died not knowing the answer was less than 2 years away. He died not knowing the cloth was already at a lab in Florida, already being analyzed, already pulling threads that led directly to the man who took his daughter. 3 days. 50 years of waiting, and he missed the answer by less than 2 years. There are no words adequate for that. But here is something that does not get told often enough. Debbie Lynn Randall's death did not only leave absence, it left something else, something that has quietly outlasted the grief, the cold case, and the killer himself. After Debbie was murdered in 1972, a woman named Joyce Dunaway Parker looked at what had happened to this community and decided that something had to be built from the wreckage. She founded the Cobb Marietta Girls Club, a nonprofit created specifically to give the city's young girls a safe space, a place to go, a place to belong. That organization eventually became part of Girls Inc., a national network empowering young women across the country. It exists, in part, because Debbie Lynn Randall existed, because her death made one woman refuse to let the fear win, October 19, 2023. 1 month after William Rose was named as Debbie's killer. Outside the Girls Inc. building on Manjay Street in Marietta, just a few blocks from where Debbie was last seen alive, a crowd gathered for a ribbon cutting. The Debbie Lynn Randall Memorial Butterfly Garden was being dedicated. Students from the Marietta Center for Advanced Academics had painted the stones that lined the garden. Local officials were there. Retired law enforcement were there. Morris Nix was there. D.A. Flynn Brody was there. And Melvin Randall was there. He stood in front of that garden and looked at the painted stones and the flowers and the people who had come to say that his sister mattered, and something in him gave way. "Y'all brought a big man like myself to my knees today," he said. Then they released the butterflies. Scores of them, lifting into the Marietta sky, spreading out over the street and the trees in the neighborhood where a 9-year-old girl once walked to a laundromat in her brand new lavender shoes. Melvin watched them go. Debbie Lynn Randall was 9 years old. She loved dolls and baseball and her brother Melvin. She had freckles and a laugh her family never forgot. She walked out of a laundromat on an ordinary Thursday evening in January 1972, and the world took 51 years to answer what happened next. Her parents died waiting. Her brother carried the guilt of a sick day for half a century, and the man who took her shoes thought he had taken everything. He hadn't. Because 51 years later, on a warm October morning in Marietta, Georgia, scores of butterflies rose into the sky in her name. Her killer was in the ground. Her brother was on his knees in gratitude. And Debbie Lynn Randall, the freckle-faced third grader from Pine Forest Elementary, was finally, after all this time, at peace. Justice has no expiration date. It just sometimes arrives too late for the people who deserve to see it most. Do you think Melvin's forgiveness toward Rose's family was the right thing to do, or is some pain simply too deep for forgiveness? If you were Juanita or John, would you have found peace waiting this long, or would the not knowing have broken you completely? And finally, do you believe justice truly means something when the person responsible never faced a single day in court? Tell us in the comments. Because in cases like this, the conversation doesn't end when the video does.